Welcome to the third and last video of this lecture. In this video, I'll be switching perspectives and I'll be talking about how refugees have used social media during their journey, but also during their integration into the host societies. Now, the popularity of smartphones and social media has not gone unnoticed during the refugee crisis. And you see here an example of a tweet that says, migrants, in between quotes, fleeing war and poverty, charging their expensive smartphones, unreal. And this is the idea that in a lot of the public debates and the media, stories and pictures of asylum seekers and migrants and refugees using their smartphones have often been met with criticism. However, many refugee stories highlight how the use of the smartphone and social media have been absolutely essential to their safety during the journey. You see a quote here from a Syrian poet that is now living in Paris, who says, "We, the exiled ones who live on antidepressants, Facebook has become our homeland. It opens the sky they close in our faces at the frontiers." So we're going to start talking about this idea of refugees using smartphones and the affordances of these devices. So the smartphone, in the case and specifically when we're talking about refugees, they use smartphones mostly to stay in contact with family and friends. They use their phones to also receive advice from others that perhaps have already taken this journey, or perhaps family members or friends that already are settled in Western societies. There was a story in the New Yorker, I believe, about a Syrian refugee who had a brother living in Sweden. And he talks a lot about how the smartphone was his lifeline. And I'll talk more about how they use the smartphone for their own safety and protection during the journey that they had to make from places like Syria to Western European countries. Um, they used, of course, the phones not only for calling and texting, but they also used internet connection to access things like social media. Another use that was absolutely crucial for refugees was GPS and map services, because, you know, when you're on foot, trying to cross from one country to the other, it's probably a good idea to know where exactly you are. But they also use it for translation applications to be able to communicate with those that they encounter. They used it for wire money transfer and, of course, for accessing social media platforms. And next, we're actually going to talk about access to social media platforms and how refugees have used social media for information gathering and decision making. So basically, refugees during their journey, and not even only during their journey, but also when they actually reach their host societies, face a situation of high uncertainty about the conditions throughout their journey, but also the condition in the country, in their potential country of destination, and about their future and livelihood in general. Generally, destination countries are very difficult to access due to border control. And even if they manage to enter a specific country, it still remains uncertain whether they will be granted a residence permit, whether they will be allowed to stay. Thus, this kind of uncertainty creates a common need for information that refugees can use when making a decision. If you think about a moment in your life when you were uncertain about something, for instance, I'll give a silly example. One of my cats got a little bit sick. Um, and I spoke to the vet, and we were waiting for some tests, and the vet proposed one of several diagnoses, right? So there was a lot of uncertainty about what could potentially be wrong with my cat. And the first thing I did was I went to the web. That was not necessarily very helpful because a lot of the symptoms overlap. So the next thing I did was I went to social media and I looked in these cat groups about what other people have experienced, whether other people have experienced the same situation with their cats, and what may be wrong, and what could be the potential solutions. So I'm in no way equating my cat situation with the plight of refugees, but just to give you an example of a situation of high uncertainty, and how that creates this need for information gathering in order for us to make a decision of what is the best course of action. So uncertainty creates this common need for information, and social media helps basically mitigate this idea that access to news and information is not necessarily a stable and dependable thing for people who are on the move, for people who are potentially in fear for their lives, or that are facing potential threats to their well-being. Smartphones have allowed refugees to have access to this sort of strategic information that is not necessarily disclosed in common traditional news media, but rather via social media and these closed or open groups that can provide them with information prior, but also during their journey. During their journey, most of the refugees have used social media for information about how accessible and how safe certain routes of getting from the Middle East to Europe are. So basically, they are using social media to find or stay in contact with smugglers who are helping, or helping in between quotes, helping them arrive on European shores one way or another. They've used social media to communicate with groups of other refugees who perhaps have traveled a certain route a few days or even hours earlier than themselves. So they're searching for information on, was it safe? What do I have to look out for? What is the best route, etc. They're using social media to plan a route to Europe, but also to learn about access to European countries. So are the borders closed? How can I get in? Is there a way to apply for or to seek asylum? And which countries are more likely to allow me to seek asylum, etc. So basically, they use social media to actually help them make a decision about a country, a destination country. But when we talk about social media and information, we also have to think about the idea that the availability of information, just because a lot of information is available in social media, does not necessarily make us better informed. And there are two major things that I want to talk about here, about the idea that access to information on social media can be limited for refugees particularly. First, through affordability. And when we talk about affordability, we talk about, can they actually afford a device that they can take with them throughout their journey, but also, do they have access to the internet, to a Wi-Fi point, or can they afford a SIM card? And there's a story of a Syrian refugee who ended up in Greece and went to buy a SIM card that would allow him to access the internet across Europe. And the vendor sold him a card saying that, yes, you will be able to access the internet anywhere in Europe. But of course, it turned out that once he crossed out of Greece, he no longer had coverage. So basically, affordability is not only about being able to afford a device, but also access to Wi-Fi or SIM cards, but also a means to actually charge your smartphone, right? Because unfortunately, they don't come with endless battery lives. But there's also limited access due to surveillance. So using phones and social media makes refugees vulnerable to unwanted surveillance, but by state or non-state actors. So, for example, some refugees talk about how they feared that the police or the Coast Guard would notice the lights coming from their smartphones or trace their signals and arrest them. There's also an example of refugees talking about how smugglers would forbid the use of smartphones and the internet, as they feared that migrants would make noise using their phones. And they could be noticed by the Coast Guard, but also they fear that in certain situations where smugglers didn't necessarily treat these refugees very well, that they would use the phones to actually contact authorities and get them arrested. There's also, a very small thing in terms of limited access. For instance, because refugees often travel by water, most of them had these plastic bags to cover their phones and keep them safe, so they could potentially use them. Now, the other part of it is, if you overcome all these issues of affordability and surveillance and so limited access, if you do gain access to social media, um, is the information you find on social media trustworthy? Basically, there's a lot of uncertainty on whether or not the information you find in social media is true. Just because the information is available, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the right kind of information that you're looking for. Because social media allows information to circulate in a very informal manner, it also creates uncertainties about truthfulness. So while refugees are often aware of this nature of social media, they're also very dependent on this type of unverified information. And a lot of them develop strategies of how to try and verify this type of information. For instance, they always trust information that comes from their own connections, like friends and families. On social media, they sometimes try to verify or triangulate information by looking at multiple sources, etc. So they try to employ certain strategies to try and figure out whether the information is true or not. Social media information can be false, but it also can be biased by vested interests. So, for example, smugglers make false promises all the time, and they claim, for instance, that this route is absolutely very safe. You can come with us, which is, of course, not necessarily a true statement. But this information can be biased also because governments are aiming to deter unauthorized refugees and migrants from arriving at their border. Now, we talked about how, so far, we've talked about how refugees use social media to gather information, to perhaps, stay in contact with their family, use smartphones to figure out where they are on a map, and so on and so forth. But refugees don't use social or haven't used social media only through their journey to European countries or elsewhere. They also keep using social media for the process of integrating into the host societies, right? And integration is a little bit of a fraught topic in the social sciences specifically. So before we can talk about social media use for integration, I have to briefly discuss what integration means and the factors that can have an impact whether someone is quote unquote successfully integrated into a society. So when we talk about the integration of refugees, researchers have proposed many different models of what integration means and what successful integration means. From the one-way models in which refugees have to completely adapt to the host societies and the host societies don't have the responsibility to adapt to them, to the two-way models characterized by the involvement of refugees and migrants, um, as well as the host societies in the adaptations of newcomers. But the model I would like to discuss today, which you can find more detailed, more described in more detail in one of the optional readings that I will be listing on the last slide of this third video, is a model that is proposed by Agar and Strang. And it's a multi-dimensional approach to integration that includes four different domains of integration. So we're talking about means and markers. So this, the authors call this more of the public face of integration. So accomplishments in these domains are considered not only as markers of successful integration, but also as means to support positive integration in other areas, right? So here we're talking about the importance of employment, housing, education, and health. They also talk about the dimension of social connections, so the importance of building relationships in the process of integration. And they talk about three very different kinds of social relations, social bridges, which are connections with members of other communities, social bonds, which are connections with a community defined by, for example, ethnic, national, or religious identity. And the third type is social links. These are connections with organizations, institutions, including local government services, for instance. They talk about the dimension of, or the domain of facilitators. And these are key domains of cultural competence, if you want, that are necessary for individuals to effectively integrate into a host society. And here is language, language and cultural knowledge, so speaking the language of the country, but also understanding the cultural norms and behaviors, and safety and security or stability. Last, they talk about the domain called foundation. And here it relates more to rights and citizenship. So this is about the extent to which the refugees are provided with the basis for full and equal engagement within their host society. So whether or not they actually have rights in this society, and whether or not they can actually get onto a path to citizenship. Now, one of the optional readings I list for this lecture actually takes these four domains of integration and applies them, or rather, Paz Alenkar, who is an assistant professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, conducted a study in which she interviewed refugees that have settled in the Netherlands to try and understand how they used or haven't used social media to achieve integration based on the dimensions proposed by Agar and Strang. So in the category of means and markers, this was the strongest one that the refugees identified with. So they said, we use social media to gather information about employment, housing, personal health problems, training programs, perhaps getting into the educational system. And here there's an example of a Facebook page called Refugees Start Force, which is devoted to the labor integration of refugees. And it's a result of actual local community initiatives, which is great for refugees. So it's a place on social media for them to help them integrate into the labor market within the Netherlands. But they also used social media to obtain and share basic information about things like locations around the Netherlands, means of transportation, shopping, market developments, and so on. They also talk a lot about how they use social media for social connections, which is the second domain of the integration model that I presented. And they talk about using it to establish links with the native population for the purpose of learning the language, but also for learning cultural norms of the Netherlands. They also talk a lot about using social connections for emotional support. So they use social media to stay connected to family and friends, whether here in the Netherlands or elsewhere in the world, to not feel so lonely, to not feel so alone, and to get that emotional support that we all need, especially in situations as precarious as those of the refugees. And of course, they talk about using social media to establish connections with people that can help them in the legal process of integrating in the Netherlands, such as immigration officers, lawyers, refugee centers, etc. Now, when it comes to facilitators and foundation, refugees report using social media a little bit less to achieve these things in terms of integration. So in the Netherlands, and I think this is more generally the case for many European Union countries, when they arrive in the Netherlands, they are generally responsible themselves for independently finding their own integration courses and their own language tests. So in this respect, social media have helped them find their way through these mazes of trying to find language and cultural learning courses. And this often happens long before they receive a residence permit or the legal right to actually stay in the country. These people are generally placed in refugee centers, and until they obtain their residence permit, they don't get access to language courses organized by these centers. So they talk about using social media to navigate this and to find their own resources to learn the language and to learn about the Netherlands in general. But when we're looking at safety and stability, the refugees talk about the fact that interactions between people on social media have not necessarily reduced discrimination and racism. And refugees generally believe that social media may even reinforce certain stereotypes of refugees fleeing from war in Syria and other African countries, as well as just generally negative impressions of Islam. In the domain of rights and citizenship, refugees talk about using Facebook community very rarely as just as general sources of information about immigration procedures, laws, and other legal issues such as taxes. Sometimes they found, very few of them have spoken about finding groups on social media that can assist them with legal services and perhaps applications for residence permits or some other kind of help. They talk about doing this mostly via offline networks. So not necessarily using social media resources for rights and citizenship. Now, this concludes the third video of this lecture. And here are some of the sources I mentioned. You are, of course, welcome to look into them if you want to know more about the concept of integration and how social media can play a role. This third video is the last one, as I said, and I really look forward to meeting all of you on April 1st and to hopefully have a very nice discussion and some nice activities to try and better understand some of the concepts that I presented to you today. See you all Thursday.